Now then, we can probably commence this evening's little discourse, and it was our intention and is our intention this time to try to see on the basis of past experience as to what would be the most expeditious and ultimately the most productive for our purposes of propagating and discussing the esoteric tradition in the future. Now, I don't think it takes a great deal of propagandizing on my part to convince you that we live in a very peculiar and very turbulent era. And apparently not only in our country here, but in many other places throughout the world. Such conditions in themselves don't really indicate a great deal. Where they point is the important element of their forecasting, because if they point to a difficult and onerous future, if their ideas are so weak that they may not continue to influence the culture or to bring in new and more helpful influences, then we are in a very bad shape. If, on the other hand, we are dealing with situations and intentionalities in the culture which are by their very nature not destined to endure too long and to give way to more useful developments, then we may not need to be too concerned. So for these reasons, it's very difficult, as always, to forecast the future. There was a sports figure whom we like to quote. Let's see, who was it? We like to quote him, but we don't know who he is.
Yogi Berra? Yes. Thank you.
Yeah, who is it now?
Yogi Berra.
Yogi Berra, right, yeah, the Yogi Bear. So I think it's the Yogi Bear who said that it's very difficult to foretell, especially in the future. So that is something that we need to no doubt take to heart. But let us say, having lived a longer life than many others, because in another month, if I'm still in this body, I shall be, 93 years old, and so that being the case, let's say my experience during that period of time, in terms of public life, in terms of the reactions of private individuals to public life, to world affairs and all sorts of things of that sort, has been quite extensive. And on that basis, let's say it would be my hunch, at least, that it will take quite a bit to reverse the somewhat deleterious course that our culture has taken. There is no unhappy development of humanity at any time that cannot be influence that cannot be stopped, and in some cases, when it appears desirable, can also be reversed. But there must be an inclination in that regard. There must be a conviction of a sufficient number of people that such developments are going to be useful and necessary. And when these kinds of ideas do not arise in sufficient numbers in the culture, then the chances are that whatever developments one is observing, they might continue to proceed in an unhappy direction. And so those are somewhat the general principles that we need to keep in mind. I have, at a very early age, old people like to reminisce. So you got to forgive me, about in every lecture, I go back to a good many years into some past events in my life, and then I say, well, now why did I say that? Is anybody really interested in that other than myself? And maybe not even myself. So it's a difficult situation, these old age reminiscences. But let us say, I will not go into too many details, but let's say there were several times in my life when I had a foreboding that things are not going in a good direction. And most of these were where I was still living in Europe, in my home country, Hungary, and subsequently in my neighbor country, Austria. And so I know that one's anxieties and prophecies, especially when they are of an undesirable nature, may or may not come true, or may come true in various degrees. But let us say, let me introduce a little event that did not occur to me, but to my uncle, my mother's brother, who, after having left his native Hungary and traveled around in various places, from Sicily to the Sudan, to South America, and eventually to Cuba, when he arrived in the United States, sometimes in the 60s, I went to visit him and I asked him, well, Uncle, you seem to have had a lot of fun in Cuba, because he was God bless him, he was a very fun-loving gentleman, and he would not have remained for any length of time in a place where he couldn't enjoy himself. So, you seem to have enjoyed yourself, but now you came over here. Why? And he said, because I smelled communists. He says, they are in the mountains, they are led by a guy with a much too long a beard by the name of Fidel Castro, and they knew that this would be trouble. So while I still could, I left and I came to Carmel, California, and that's where we were sitting and drinking one cocktail after the other. In any event, these are all issues that pertain to the fact that one develops a kind of sensitivity, a sort of psychological smell of some conditions that you have encountered before and which were very unhappy and very deleterious to you. And when you begin to have that smell once again, then you become aware of it, and if at all possible, do something about it. I would say that the present conditions in our culture, here in the United States and increasingly in Western Europe and other places too, are somewhat of that nature. But once again, I think we need to voice warnings about a too heavy and oppressive determinism, because nothing in this world is determined. Some things may become determined if they progress further. Some things may go in a different direction, and therefore the old and very good saying of hope springs eternal should always be with us. Now, with that somewhat dark and somewhat hopeful prediction, I'll try to proceed to my subject. I do things like that. So the subject since the first of this month has been to gain more information about the esoteric tradition. And we took a look at it from the distant past. We are taking a look at it today with perhaps a somewhat nearer past, and then we may come to certain conclusions that would indicate to us what we might expect in the future. Now, first of all, it's useful to recollect that there has apparently always been, in every part of the world and in every culture and in every spiritual religious milieu, there has always been a tradition that may be called and has been called esoteric. Namely, that in addition to the mainstream trends of the culture, which of course inevitably include religion, or if you don't want to use that term, spirituality, they always include that, because as Alan Watts, a great and marvelous wise man of our age, whom I shall never forget, I never shall forget his cigarette, and on the speaker stand, with a big stage, smoking and stomping out his cigarette. That was the first time that I saw him in the flesh. I had already subscribed to the journal that he was editing in London called The Middle Way, which was the journal of the Buddhist Society. And so I was familiar with his style and with his orientation, but I was not so familiar with his cigarettes. And you know what? I liked them. Not that I smoked many cigarettes at that time. Even now I prefer a cigar. But let us say, to me it was a declaration on Alan's part that no matter where he was, whether he was in Chicago, where he had been an Episcopal priest just before he came here, or for any other reason, that he was a free man. And that's a very difficult position to occupy in this world. And if you can occupy it well and happily and with the cooperation of your friends, then you're a lucky man, which I think he was. Now, in any event, Mr. Alan Watts had indicated that how did he put it? That there was no time in world history when any country survived and achieved any degree of prominence that was not totally imbued with and dominated by religion. Now, if you know something about Alan Watts, he was certainly not a religious fanatic, and even though he was an ordained Episcopal priest, but he was also a truth sayer. And if one looks into the history of the world, one will find that to be very largely true. Because humans have various needs, and some of these needs are obviously physical. We have to eat, we have to drink, we have to do various things, we have to have a roof over our head, we want to protect ourselves against various dangers, but in addition to that, we have to have as much of a connection with transcendence as we possibly can. We must recognize that no matter how many experiences we may have in this world, and no matter how we may handle our various activities in the physical world, that there is something else. And that unless we have gained a reasonable closeness with that something else, then our life here in this world has not amounted to much. That somehow the meaning, the deeper dimension, the intimations of the future and the results of the past all can be concentrated in our relationship to that which transcends this world. And once again, I don't mean to proclaim that relationship has to be terribly large and terribly intense. It doesn't mean that we have to talk with God every day, or more importantly, have Him talk to us every day, which would be nice, but very seldom happens, But it means that at various levels of the expression of our consciousness, we have moved closer and closer to another reality, to another dimension, which has a relationship to this one. In fact, in a certain sense, it is rooted in our present reality, but it extends far beyond. As the old Greeks said that, yes, we have all these functions of our soul, and they extend to the relating to the physical world, they extend to relating to the other regions of cognition in addition to physical, namely to emotional, to intellectual, and to intuitive. And then they said, if you are very lucky, and if you went about your life in this world the right way, then you may step sort of across a big step. You might go up to a certain point on a stairway, and that stairway leads into another dimension. It looks different, it feels different, it is different, and in fact, if you manage to continue to deal with it and derive insight and inspiration and energy from that dimension, then you might say at the end of your earthly life that you have gained something very important, that perhaps you have gained something that cannot be gained in any other way. And of course, in the the ancient Mediterranean world, and starting with that one, but don't be afraid, I'm not going to get stuck in the Peloponnesus or somewhere like that. We have to move closer to our own time and to our own place. But in any event, the Greco-Roman world, which really included a considerable amount of remnants of the ancient Egyptian world, that ancient world had made provisions for possible interaction with and training within this other dimension. And what were they? They were what were in the ancients called the mysteries. Mysteria in Latin. And I always sidestep the possibly unpleasant likelihood of saying mystery schools, because these were not schools. The Greeks and the Romans and the Egyptians did not run little red schoolhouses on the prairie. First of all, they didn't have a prairie. Secondly, they didn't have a little red schoolhouse. So obviously they didn't. But what it was, nevertheless, was these were places of instruction, and following the instruction, experience. Experience which, in all likelihood, couldn't be gained anywhere else but there. Because the people who were guiding the initiates or about to be initiates have themselves gone through these processes, knew how to induce others, and were, let's say, experienced in what could be called the priestcraft of the mysteries. And that undoubtedly was a great benefit to those particular cultures. Because this being perhaps one of the great differences in our world today, we can wander from pillar to post, and we can go to Ephesus, and we can go to Eleusis or places like that, and all we are going to see are statues and ruins, and it's not very likely that somebody will be there and say, come on, I will show you something, come on. I will show you how you can not just hear about this, not just talk about this, not just write about this, but that you can experience this. And this was a tremendous benefit of the ancient world. But now we know well and good that the ancient world is called the ancient world because it's no longer here. That's why it's ancient. And so that, of course, is a certain difficulty. But on the other hand, let's say, especially when this has been my experience with my studies and personal experiences, that once you have touched the other, whatever we may call it, once you have touched the realm of transcendence, once you have touched that which is beyond where you are now, you never forget it. And you will never give it up. You will, if you have lost contact with it, you will seek to renew that contact. If that is not the case, then maybe you will wander from here to the end of the world to find that experience again. People have done that, and some have done it under various auspices. I was just looking at a lovely little book that a friend of mine who is not here tonight has given to me, which is the life story of a countryman of mine back in the 18th century. I'm a Hungarian, and my countryman in this case was a man called Alexander Csoma de Körs, who was a Transylvanian university student, with very impecunious, coming from a fairly poor family, but very, very great scholar nevertheless. You know what this man did in the 18th century? He picked up his shoes and put them on his feet, and he put up an old sheepskin jacket, and he walked from Eastern Europe all the way to Tibet. Why? In order to discover what was going on over there, and he had a little idea fix. Most scholars do, you know. I have been around university people maybe more than I should have. It's usually not too much fun, you know. But let's say I have found that people have they have a deep-seated desire for something that they indications of which they may find in their scholarship, but which really stands as a symbol of their heart's desire. There is the desire of your head. There are. I don't need to say that there are desires of other bodily and instinctual parts, but there is a desire of the heart, old saying. And this desire of the heart will move you, if at all possible, toward its goal. And so that's what happened with this little impecunious Transylvanian student. And by the way, Transylvania, in spite of the signs in the culture, should not be inevitably associated with Dracula and vampires, you know, because actually when I lived in Hungary, and I never lived in Transylvania, but I traveled there, it's the mountainous region that is to the east of Hungary and joins Hungary with Romania. In any event, we never heard of vampires. We knew that those mountains were full of bears, and that the communist dictator Ceausescu was making more money out of selling the right to foreigners to come and shoot bears in the Transylvanian mountains than anywhere else. I think he mentioned one. The people here are poor, they can't pay me enough taxes, so I'll sell the right to hunting bears. That's how I make money. He was a real character. But he, as so many of these kinds of people, he came to an evil end. In any event, what we have there is a culture that never spoke of vampires. Now, I am not an expert on vampires, although the subject fascinates me as it fascinates others, and I don't think there's anything wrong to be fascinated with weird things. Because if you're not fascinated with the weird, then why should you be fascinated with the everyday life, you know? So if you're going to be fascinated with anything, you should be fascinated with that which is unusual, which is extraordinary, which is weird, and which is maybe even a little bit scary, you know? Why? Because I know that to be frightened or to be scared is not a terribly pleasant experience. But on the other hand, think back a little bit. A few times in your life when you were good and scared, as we put it in English, and you know what? You may get a little goosebumps going down your back and think, but there's a certain pleasure with it. Oh yeah, that was the time when I got really scared, haha. So it's one of those emotions that leaves a residue in the human. But I did not experience that notion in Transylvania, although I saw bears and Transylvanian Hungarians and Romanians and Germans, but nothing else. Now, that being the case, this particular Transylvanian young man had an idea. Thus far, his idea was absolutely accurate, and that was that back around the year 900, the Hungarians came to their present habitat in Hungary from outside. That they came over the passes of the Carpathian Mountains from the east, sort of more or less where you would have the much disputed Ukraine at the present times and Poland, and then they came in and came to occupy their present country. And that therefore there has always been the question in the minds of Hungarian scholars, okay, where did our ancestors come from? Where the heck did they come from? And of course, in any detail that has never been disclosed. But it definitely was from the East, and as subsequently various geographical and ethnographic studies were made available by travelers, by colonists, particularly the British scholars who went straight from Oxford or from Cambridge to, to Timbuktu. They were always on the move. So we acquired various forms of information. And one of these was about a small, reclusive, sort of standoffish people on top of the Himalayan mountains called the Tibetans. And what Alexander Choma de Curus had discerned already from living where he was at the university in Transylvania, he discovered numerous similarities in some linguistic forms, in a number of traditions which the travelers had brought back from East Asia and from Tibet, and what was still extant among the Hungarian people. And so he said, I've got to go there and find out. And without anything, without any money in his pocket, without any contacts anywhere, he took off, and traveling most of the time on his feet, which we in Hungary used to call the horses of the apostles, because the apostles were not rich enough to have horses. So they also traveled on their feet, St. Paul and all of these old boys. But in any event, so he took off, and after a long, long trip and many, many contacts of various kinds, and particularly a great deal of help from the British colonial representatives who were already to be found on his way as he went to Persia, Mongolia, north of India, and so forth, and finally he arrived there. He studied the Tibetan language. He wrote the first English-Tibetan dictionary that anybody had prepared up to that time. And I suppose he probably added a Hungarian word here and there too. But in any event, and then he befriended a good many prominent Tibetan monks, studied the Tibetan religion, all sorts of things. Finally, I think largely owing to his upbringing, which consisted of very poor nourishment because he was so poor, he was not in good health, and so at a fairly early age he died in the borderlands of Tibet, and the British resident erected a statue to him in Darjeeling on the borderlands, saying that this is the man who did the greatest service to the world by studying the Tibetan language and the Tibetan culture. Now, if you ask me why I mentioned this to you, the likelihood is that I will move the subject to something else. But let us say one of the issues being that when one has a deep desire of the heart for something, and pursues that with all his or her available resources of one kind or the other, then the rewards of that in various ways will always arise. One of the immediate conclusions to be drawn from that is that we should listen to what is inside of us, and listen to your heart, listen to your feelings, listen to the deeply hidden, profound recesses of your consciousness. And if you listen carefully, and if you don't give up listening, you will hear important and interesting things which may take you to some very great and exciting and inspiring places of life. At least I have found it so. But you have to learn how to listen. And that is why the first characteristic of our culture and civilization that comes to mind, at least at this point, and that is germane to the subject, is all the noise that we are creating. How can you listen to the still small voice that it has been called inside of you if there is so much noise around, you know? And this is unfortunate because it's one of those commodities that needs to be fought. You know, we can use another term, but it is true that there are certain features of life that we have to resist. Because if we don't resist them, then they get to us too much. And when they get to us too much, they squeeze out the good that we went to find. And so I think it's good to have a critical sense in one's character to begin with. And my father would tell me very openly in front of others, son, if you think that some people you are dealing with are stupid or that they are bad people, then say so. And say it to me and then I will evaluate it. Don't be afraid to say what you recognize to be that. Maybe it's not the eternal truth, but it may be a truth that will be helpful in life. And so that is really very important. Now then, having wandered away from our subject matter, I think quite widely, I shall leave Alexander Choma the Körisch in Darjeeling for the time being and indicate that we always had something, we humans, no matter where we are, from the Amazons to Tasmania, by Australia and everywhere else. Everywhere people are looking for something. They may not know what they are looking for. In fact, most of the time they don't. But they know that they haven't got it. That's why they are looking for it. So, and this needs to be kept in mind. And so because of this deep internal inquisitiveness that humans have, they also were never, in the long run, were never really satisfied in any culture with with what the culture offered in terms of spirituality. And because people were not satisfied with the preachments and practices of the mainstream religions. Now, religion, by its very definition, of course, exists for the purpose of religio, as we call it in Latin, to rejoin us with something, to rejoin us with a greater reality. And that is always there. But especially where institutionalized spirituality, institutional religion are already present, then people will be inclined to go along with that and not look any deeper. And of course, many of the reasons for that is that when an approach to spirituality establishes itself as a dominant force in a culture, then that's just what it becomes. It becomes a dominant force. And if somebody comes up and seems to be practicing or seems to be advocating another way to the same end, then the dominant force will crush them. This is known technically in a lot of places as orthodoxy, which is really a poor word because it's a Greek word meaning the right faith. It means it's the faith that the people over there consider to be the right one, but it might not be the right one for you. And so this is what happened rather soon, maybe a little bit sooner than in most cases, to Christianity. You got to remember that Christianity, from the beginning, was within the aegis of monotheistic religiosity. It was an offspring of Judaism, later on you might say a relative of Islam, but it was a monotheistic religion. Now, one of the good points of monotheism are that monotheists, as a rule, will pursue single-mindedly their objective of what they may be seeking for. They will concentrate on the one God that they believe in and in the teachings that lead to that, and that concentration will eventually redound to their benefit. But at the same time, when you concentrate very heavily on one teaching and at the same time ignore the other teachings that are around, obviously you will also limit yourself. And this is what's happening to this day to the monotheistic religions, and this is what happens throughout its history with Christianity. Now, if I recall correctly, and I seldom recall with my geriatric memory, and that one of the last times when we were doing what we are doing now, I indicated and I mentioned that there was a certain kind of a break in the fabric and in the fabric of resistance and knowledge of the Christian religion, and that curiously enough it occurred right around the year 2000. Now, I am not a great astrologer, not even a little astrologer, and I am not a stargazer, but it's true. And one great modern scientist who himself was a sort of a stargazer. I mean, he knew astrological data, namely Carl Gustav Jung said that with the year 2000 there was a break in Western history. And the break was to he said that, it was the age of Pisces until then. And actually even beyond that. So he said what happens with the age of Pisces is that if you look at the symbol of Pisces, it's two fish, and they're swimming in the opposite direction. Usually the one fish is a dark fish with a light colored eye or spot in it, and the other one is of the opposite color. And what Jung said that now the time is coming for the dark fish, for that part of the spiritual message of the Piscean age that was there all along, but that needed to come forth. And when you look at Christian history, or history of the Christian Middle Ages, you'll see that all kinds of diverse and peculiar and at times amusing and at times amazing forms of spirituality just came forth. Everything from witchcraft to ceremonial magic to alchemy to all sorts of other things, all of a sudden there they were. And of course also some of the remnants of the ancient heresies that were thriving quite well before the beginning of the Piscean age, such as the remnants of Neoplatonism, which is really the source of all ceremonial magic, is Neoplatonism. Neoplatonism, Hermeticism, and Gnosticism, in various disguises, they started coming forth. And all of a sudden we saw, which we mentioned here before, and in March we always have a commemoration of the great Cathar heresy, also called the Albigensian heresy, in the south of what is now the south of France, and various others that all came out after that period of time. Now what happens is that particularly in monotheistic religions, I mentioned before, because of their monotheistic religions are obsessive religions. What does that mean? They are obsessed with God. Now, is that bad? If it's bad, then I've been doing it all my life. However, everything that has a real good side in this life also has its dangers. And fanaticism and the desire to persecute others who see reality in another way, and all these matters arise out of that kind of orientation. So now we had a big commotion in southern Europe primarily, south of France, north of Italy, around there, with the Albigensian or Cathar religion, and a tremendous amount of bloodshed and destruction, the burning of the heretics, which has left very deep wounds in the European soul. Not a terribly long time thereafter, less than 100 years thereafter, which in history isn't long, there was another. And this was the destruction by a money-hungry king and his money-hungry associate, who was a pope, of the Knights Templar. And this occurred also in France, but all over the country of France. And while the Cathar persecutions affected the entirety of the populace. I mean, when the inquisitors came to burn heretics, they didn't ask whether you were a nobleman, or whether you were a merchant, or whether you were an agriculturist. If you're a Cathar, come on. We got a barbecue going, which is probably too irreverent to mention. But let us say, while the persecution of the Templar Knights, which extended actually to a much larger territory than France, although it was a French order, was more confined because the majority of the knights who were being persecuted were of the French knightly class. They were minor and sometimes not so minor noblemen. So what happened was that a very large stratum of French society, every family had an executed Templar in its ranks. Now what do you do when you have that sort of thing? Well, you get good and mad, as we call it, and you keep the memory of the indignity that has been inflicted on your family with you. And so what happened was that two great centers of, well, how should we call it, of disaffection, of unhappiness and of suffering were set loose in the fair land of France. Now we need to remember that France was initially probably the biggest and the most active Catholic country in Europe. The elder daughter of the church, as it was called, because France with Madeleine and so forth, you always envision the French as feminine, at least I do, and for good reasons. But let us say, a deep-seated unhappiness and disaffection spread over the land. And the people who were thus disaffected did not have the wherewithal to do much about this except to say, well, the time will come when we will have our day and when we will pay back. We'll pay the Catholic Church and we'll pay the crown back for what they have done to our society and to our people. And it is said that when King Louis XVI, a very, very fine and very honest individual, when King Louis XVI was led up on the scaffold to be beheaded by the guillotine, he exclaimed, "This is the revenge of Jacques de Molay." Jacques de Molay having been the executed Grand Master of the Templars. So, which I think is a good symbolic manifestation. In other words, what has happened in the past, the injustices that various people in various classes have suffered in the past is now coming back. And of course, that was already at the time of the French Revolution. Okay, now, whatever it is, all right. So let us say, with this extensive and almost too extensive an introduction, I have come up to the great turning point of European history, the results of which, or some of the results of which, we are still suffering. There were two great changes, two great uprisings, two great turnarounds that occurred very close together. They are referred to in both cases as revolutions, although I think the first one does not deserve that name, the so-called American Revolution, which should really be called the freedom fight. In the a national uprising, the birth of a new nation. But there was also another one in France, which really got out of hand, and which ultimately caused a tremendous bloodshed, a tremendous social upheaval, and let's say the beginning of certain psychospiritual developments in Europe, which for the most part were deleterious and had caused a great deal of difficulty. Now, that being the case, there was, as you know, undoubtedly you heard about him, there was a prognosticator, a prophet, a little bit earlier in French history, whose name was Michel de Notre Dame, and who by his Latin name was called Nostradamus. Now, Nostradamus was not just an astrologer, he was a seer, and many interesting episodes are recounted about his life, which is not our subject to deal with, but let us say he foretold one thing. He said the time would come which he called the vulgar Advent. Now, you know, Advent means coming, that's why it's the season before Christmas. And vulgar, well, we know what vulgar is. Unfortunately, we know it all too well. We have nothing but profanity and vulgarity on our streets. We should know what it is. In any event, the vulgar Advent was the rising to the surface of a mentality of people who were vulgar, who had no culture, who had their own ideas and their own force, but let's say whom you rather not have running the show. And that was the French Revolution. And once again, we need to keep in mind that if you look, and I'm not about to detail the history of the French Revolution, but if you look at the earlier phases of the French Revolution, it wasn't really a revolution either, just like the American. In fact, some of the same people were in both. The Marquis de Lafayette was in both the French Revolution and the American Revolution, and so forth. And so, however, what we say is that while the original people who wanted to change much in society in France and so forth were all quite cultured and honorable people, in short order, they were either departing for other countries or they had their heads cut off. Because the worst, the most cruel, the most unreasoning, the most demonic element of society, the vulgus, for the vulgar Advent, had come to the top. And this consisted, at least at the very top, of people like Robespierre, like Danton, like Marat, and so forth, who felt that their labor, the purpose of their lives was killing people. And they sure did it also. And so let's say, once again, we have to keep in mind. So it may be quite thrilling to hear or to sing the Marseillaise, Allons s'en va, enfants de la patrie, toujours de la gloire est arrivée, and so forth. But at the same time, if you think of all the heads that were rolling off the guillotine to that song, and the ever more impossible conditions that were introduced. I had a great-grandfather who was in Paris at that time, an Austrian man in business, who happened to get stuck in Paris. And I remember his diaries, and so saying that, he says, I was walking in blood up to my ankles on the streets of Paris, a place where if I absolutely don't have to, I shall never return to. So he went back, he went back to Austria. From Austria he went to Hungary. He said, this is about as far away from France as you can still be in a civilized country. This is where I'm going to live. And married a Hungarian lady, obviously. In any event, it was a terrible situation. But it wasn't, let's see, how should I put it? I have to conclude this. It wasn't just the guillotine and that, the reign of terror, as it's often called, of the French Revolution itself. But then, what all happens, the revolution was kind of put down, then came Napoleon, this and that, and then around, not so terribly much later, about 1860, the remaining French government, Napoleon III, I think, was involved in it, had started a war or participated in a war with Germany, with Prussia as it was called at that time. And that was called the Franco-Prussian War, quite accurately. Now, the Franco-Prussian War was lost on the part of the French. It was a very, very bloody and terrible war, and the people, Paris was enclosed by German troops. The people didn't have anything to eat. As people said, the French were eating mice and rats in Paris because there was no food. So it really got to be very bad. And as it often happens in such difficult circumstances, how should we put it? A bunch of people with very little sense and very little logic took over. And they called themselves and their activity the Commune. And they had all kinds of plans which fortunately they did not accomplish. They were going to tear down Notre Dame, they were going to tear down the Tuileries, they were going to tear down everything that was old and nice. But as good fortune had it, a French general with a Scottish name and the relative of Ed McMahon, who was on the television years ago, Maréchal Mac-Mahon, as they call him in France, came with his troop, beat up the communards, and restored the city, and built the beautiful church of the Sacré-Cœur on the Montmartre, because he made a vow that if he's able to go in and liberate Paris from these white people, then he's going to build a church. All right. But what we inherited from that time? The word communist. Communist, somebody who follows the commune, a communist. And that stayed with us ever since. And really, if you look them up in some good dictionary or so, those communists were really weird people. and they had weird and terrible plans. And so they set sort of the pattern for that kind of extreme revolutionary attitude, a kind of neo-Jacobinism, which has remained with us ever since. Now, all right, that pretty much brings us up to really modern times. So what we need to keep in mind is that after 1,000 years and better of peaceful, although no doubt not always happy life, Europe became prey to weird, irrational political developments, among which the communism born at that time was an important part, and the French Revolution itself. And somehow the balance of societal life in Europe was upset, and has remained upset ever since. So to the present day, whether we are looking at the Russian Revolution in the 1920s, or whether we are looking at some of the wild and unreasonable and unnecessary things that are going on now, all of these things are somehow the continuation of the Commune and of the Reign of Terror. Now, obviously, there is no human action, no human development in history that does not bring some good with it as well. And so I'm mentioning the bad because the bad continued. This is another curious phenomenon. The bad in history has usually a more limited lifespan, but sometimes it goes on and on. And so to this day, we are suffering the results of the red Jacobin hat in Paris during the Reign of Terror and various other terrible things that came as the result of that incredible upheaval and all of its associated upheavals in other countries, because going on and on and on, right up to the present time, we are still, let's say, suffering the results of the French Revolution. And this being the case, we may keep in mind, in conclusion now, as to how has Europe, and even more powerfully the United States of America, managed to extricate itself from the confused and confusing and bloodthirsty atmosphere of these revolutions that came either in the form of the French Revolution or as the result of it, and how has there ever been some order restored in the world? Well, we may, bye-bye, we may need to keep in mind that allowing for all kinds of differences, we may be entering and hopefully not remaining within an era of history that is a little bit similar. And there are times in history when the desire to act up and to cause difficulties and to beat up other people and kill other people and so forth becomes so powerful that it becomes a major factor in society until the more peaceful elements of society decide that they have to do away with it somehow. And that is when people like Ed McMahon's ancestor, Marshal McMahon, and others come in with their troops and beat the unruly crowds back. Now, this is all metaphor and historical data. But let us say we are still suffering the results of the change of the centuries in 1800 and thereafter. And we need to keep in mind, although probably few will, that the one place where there was no reign of terror, the one place where there was no guillotine, the one place where nobody was persecuted was the United States of America. Now, you can speculate and you can add in all kinds of factors, but I think it's a good sign that we were able, and with your ancestors more than mine, because I came here in my lifetime, we were able to fight off the vulgar advent, the destructive forces of the underpinnings of society. And by fighting them off, we're able to go and live another day. So, and we may also keep in mind, and I conclude on that, and I will reserve that probably for next week, that if one looks with some perspicacity and a deep look into these developments, you find that the esoteric tradition, the secret orders, were there. And in one case, in France, tried to stop the reign of terror, which was mainly stopped by people like MacMahon and others. All of these were, high-grade French Freemasons who commanded the army, or, when it comes to the United States, the leaders of the American Revolution. So let us keep in mind that there are times in history when the esoteric tradition must exert as much influence as it can and try to help the situation for whatever conditions it may be in. And the same is the condition today. And some of the details of that, if you're interested as to what I suggest, so there you're going to get a lot more, how should we put it, the personal suggestions of the old man of the mountain over here, as to how the unsavory, the bad elements in the correct developments can be stopped, and how the esoteric tradition can contribute to stopping them and to turning them to the better. But it has happened in the past. Remember, there have been bad things in the past. There has been bloodshed in the past. There have been people hanging from the lanterns in the streets. There was blood flowing in Paris, and still it recovered. And in the same way it will recover now, and especially in a place where insight, moderation, tradition was such an important part of the foundation of the United States, which must continue and which must remain victorious. So long live America, God bless America, and God bless freedom. A side issue, I think I mentioned it before and I was going to bring it. one of the truly most informative books that I have come across in several years is this. It's called Modern Occultism by Mitch Horowitz, whom some of you may have come across somewhere, who is, among other things, I mean, I like Mitch because he's just a delightful fellow, but this is, how should I put it, this is one of the best organized, best written historical books on any subject, and I've always been a history buff. So take a look at it. It costs quite a bit, and I intend to order, it's around $30 for a paperback book. But if you are interested, just kind of whisper in my ear, because I'm going to order a few copies that we can sell here. And I promise you I'll be able to sell them to you at discount. So it's a very, very well done, very interesting work, Modern Occultism by Mitch Horowitz. Please take a look at it. So thank you again so much for coming, and
thank you.